Okay, I would like to start. It's I think it's a great honor for us. It's a great honor for us to have Mr. Shulman here tonight. And I have to say that with the previous generation, we went to Los Angeles and we saw quite an astonishing amount of work by Neutra and many other. Is it working? Yes. By Albert Frey and many others, knowing that for example, the work of Neutra, we and let's say people in Europe knew about by the photographs by Julius Shulman. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Mr. Shulman tonight to you. And fortunately enough, we don't have only Mr. Shulman here, but also Pierluigi Sereno, who did a book with Mr. Shulman on a lot of architecture in Los Angeles, which is not known. So besides work of Frey and Neutra, there are many other architects included, and I have to admit that there is work in it which I myself don't know. So I think it's an incredible opportunity for us to have both here to speak. But besides that book which is presented here tonight, there's another book which is the complete work of Richard Neutra. It's kind of heavy for me to present to you, but with a lot of work by Mr. Shulman. He has over 6,000 files, I was told today. So he actually has an incredible archive of what let's call it modern architecture in Los Angeles was and is. So I'm very happy to have you here, and I give the floor to both of you. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for coming by, taking your time to listen to Pierluigi Sereno. Pierluigi, my colleague, came from Messina, Sicily to California, where he received his master's degree in architecture. He's now continuing his studies in Berkeley, California, and University of California. And Pierluigi and I have a great background, which we'll talk about later, and he'll describe it too. First of all, are you all in a hurry? Does anyone have a date? Because this may take at least 10 minutes. Okay, now, by the way, may I ask the producer there, the motion picture man, for our film we have to turn off the lights.
Oh, it's not my department.
Now, do I have the control? Yeah. Now, before we start the actual film, want to see my face? Okay. Now, we are doing a few things tonight. Pierluigi came in from California to meet us here, and myself and my daughter and my grandson are here, Judy McKee and Timothy McKee, and they're my assistant. They're organizing our whole trip. And can we turn off the projection for just a minute, please? Thank you. Now you can still see me, that's all that matters. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is that our plan with Benedict Taschen who produced the books for us, including my autobiography and other material on architecture. The purpose of our trip was to introduce the two books, but also to speak to students throughout the area in Cologne, Munich, Vienna, Berlin, now here, and then tomorrow we go to London. But all this is for the purpose of introducing not just our books, but trying to help architectural students and educators who we hold responsible for making better architects out of people who have some hopes of revolutionizing the world of architecture. And therefore, in our story tonight, we're trying to show how Pierre Luigi and I work together in producing our Modernism Rediscovered book, which is here for you to see. And then also the Richard Neutra Complete Works book, which is a huge volume. And it's the first time that any publisher has ever shown the work of Richard Neutra in almost its completion. Because at the time that Neutra died, many of our archival material never were published by Neutra. So we have a twofold process of being here tonight. Now, can we get some chairs for those people coming in?
There's plenty of chairs.
Unless you want to stand. If there's any good-looking young girls, you can come here and sit with me. And Pierre Luigi, being from Italy, is also, thank you. And Pierre Luigi is a very romantic guy, so anyhow, any young lady want to make yourself at home, you can come and join us. And the rest, fine, sit on the floor if you want to. There's room on the floor here. We had an audience at the Humboldt Institution in Berlin last night. We must have had, how many? 1,000 people there, I think. And many of them were sitting on the floor. So I think one other thing we will do tonight, after we finish our program, and or possibly in between, Pierre Luigi and I will talk about some of the things we're showing. And perhaps if during the process of our program, anybody have any questions, don't hesitate to raise your hand. And if you can't understand our great speech in English or my wonderful knowledge of German, which I'll tell you about later, but if so, I don't think you should ever hesitate to raise your hand. It's not going to be a formal speech. So that's part of the story tonight. I think we can start going to work and tell you much about our background, the history of my personal life, and Pierre Luigi will add his thoughts, because we worked together for a couple, 3 years at least, in preparing our Modernism book, which he'll describe as we start working. So for the time being, let's turn off the lights and we'll go to work. And this is where it all began in my life. Now, the shadows are good down here, and the shadow on Mr. Neutra's beard, we'll leave it. Now, I met Mr. Neutra by accident, sheer chance, by fate, because I had gone to university in Berkeley and UCLA in Los Angeles for 7 years. And in the middle of February 1936, I came home from Berkeley feeling that I had spent 7 years at university, never graduated, never majored in any subject. I bummed around, had a good time. And, but 2 weeks after I came home from Berkeley, by chance, I photographed one of Mr. Neutra's first houses, the Kuhn House, up in the Hollywood Hills. And this is a picture I had, a small Eastman Kodak, what we call a vest pocket camera. It shot small prints, small negatives. And this is the Kuhn House. I went to visit with one of Neutra's associates, apprentices, who I have just met. And as a result, this is another view I took with this little Kodak camera. And then it ended up, and not ended, but it progressed to 1947. And this is at Richard Neutra Kaufman House in Palm Springs. It's an example of what a cameraman, by the way, are there photographers here tonight, or are they all just hard-working students? No photographers here tonight? Just raise your hand, I'm just curious. No. All right. Good, great. Make a note. Just a little lesson for you. Okay. I was in the house with Mr. Neutra for 3 days, photographing the interiors, a few of the outside pictures too, but mostly interiors. And towards the end of the third day in March 1947, it was a warm springtime day, evening. I went outside to see the sky was developing this great, wonderful alpenglow as it does in the California desert. And I quickly ran back into the house, and Mr. Neutra and Mr. Kaufman were standing, talking, wondering, didn't see where I went. And I came back in the house, picked up my camera, the 4x5 view camera and the tripod, and with my shoulder bag and film, I started to go outside. And Mr. Neutra shouted at me, "Shulman, where are you going?" And I said, "Mr. Neutra, Richard," I called him, "come on outside, you'll see a most beautiful view. The mountains, the sun has set, the sky is beautiful," even in black and white, by the way. Color wouldn't do justice to this. But Mr. Neutra grasped my arm to hold me back. "Shulman, don't go out, we've got to do more pictures inside. Mr. Kaufman wants to go to sleep." So I said no. I broke away from Mr. Neutra, and in doing so, and this is a word of advice to photographers and architects, don't ever hesitate. If you want to do something, whether it's to design a house or kiss a beautiful woman or whatever you want to do it. No one's going to stop you. I broke away from Mr. Neutra, and this picture came out of a 45-minute exposure, and I made history without realizing it. When I put my film slide back in the film holder and put the film back into my case, I didn't know what I had. As Walter Gropius said to me when I had a meeting with him in later years, he's referring to this photograph especially, he said, "Shulman," he said, "you don't realize it, but we architects," and referring to himself, from our experience, when you take a photograph, and referring to this picture, he said, "Honestly, did you know that you had a famous photograph? You created an icon by doing this film, even though you broke away from Mr. Neutra, who didn't want you to go outside?" So he made a statement, which we have in one of my books, which says that the photographer nor the architect really knows what he has achieved. It's like this picture. We turned lights on inside the house and take a short exposure, closed my shutter, ran into the house and turned some other lights on. The soffit lights, the pool light came on last. And when we had Mr. Kaufman turn on the pool light, we noticed that it was a glaring, strong light. So I asked Mrs. Kaufman, who was there, if she'd mind lying down on this little cushion, which I placed next to the pool. And I had Ania raise herself up on her elbow and to block the light. And she looks like a piece of sculpture. In the shadow you see next to her is a little puppy dog, and the paw prints in the background. The dog was in the pool, on the edge of the pool. The dog ran over to Mrs. Kaufman. Anyhow, she shouted to me, "Shulman, hurry up, I can only sit down like this for a few seconds." So I said, "Well, Mrs. Kaufman, stay quiet for 3 seconds and I'll count 1, 2, 3, click." And the picture was over. 45 minutes in the whole operation. And this is what came out. But that's the story of photography. But you have to have purpose. And also the willingness to do something against the will of, say, the architect. This is another view we took recently. The house was restored by another architect in Los Angeles. And the landscaping is all new. And there's the staff of the architect and his assistants. But I took the picture allowing the people to be in the photograph. Now here is an example of another house that Richard Neutra did in Palm Springs. And look at the mountain in the background, by the way. This, the mountain with the snow on it is Mount San Gorgonio, which is the highest mountain in Southern California, 11,485 feet tall, where we used to go skiing in wintertime. But this house was abandoned for a long time and is falling apart. Now suddenly somebody bought the house, and she's using my photographs as the new owners of the Kaufman house did to restore it to its normal original position. And this is an example also. I'm dwelling considerably about Richard Neutra's work because he was a man who started me in my career, and also in the pattern of his existence, we're able to reproduce how he used water in his architectural solution. This is a medical building in Southern California. He said, why should a medical building be closed in with dark rooms, which frightens the patients? And they also had dentists in this building. He said, just imagine if you're in a dark little room with one little soft light on your teeth while the dentist is drilling into your teeth. So he has his dental chairs facing this little pond of beautiful water inside the length of the building. And this is the Richard Neutra Kaufman house in the valley, which is no longer existent. It was torn down. And this points out the need for powerful legislation. We should have laws to protect important buildings. This, unfortunately, was torn down before we had such controls. But nowadays, this would never be permitted. Inside that wall, this was a home that Neutra did for von Sternberg, the famous motion picture producer and director in Hollywood. He wanted a private space. And so Richard Neutra designed this big aluminum wall to protect the house from people driving by in the street. And behind the wall is Richard Neutra sitting there on the left. And this is the home of Ayn Rand, the publisher, the writer of Fountainhead. And this is a good example of how Richard Neutra was able to create a wonderful space out in the middle of a valley in Southern California. This is the Neutra Maslin house in Palm Springs. We're showing this also because when we photographed the house for Richard Neutra, he did not like the furniture that Mrs. Maslin, who was a collector of modern art of great fame, and all the artworks, the sculpture, and the paintings in the rest of the house are all some of the finest contemporary artwork in the country, in the United States, and the whole world for that matter. But when we took the pictures for Mr. Neutra, I'm not showing you how barren and empty the house was when we photographed it for him. But I asked Mrs. Maslin, the owner, if we could come back and photograph his house with the furniture in the proper position, the way she used the house. And she allowed us to come back 2 weeks later, photograph the house. Connaissance des Arts, this French art magazine, had asked me at that time, do I have a modern house with a good art collection? Well, I just happen to have this great collection, world famous collection, in a very famous Richard Neutra house. And 2 or 3 months later, I got a copy in the mail of the copy of the magazine, cover and 8 pages in color inside, which would never have happened if I had not taken the initiative to go back and photograph the house the way Mrs. Maslin lived. It was a beautiful experience. Again, those of you who are architects or hope to be architects, please be human about how people live in your house. Don't wipe it clean and empty the way Neutra used to do it, because he was more interested in the image of a house, pure architecture, without furniture. He didn't care about having it published in producers or or public magazines which would give you an opportunity to understand what architecture is all about and how people live in a well-designed house. This is the Neutra Lovell House in the Hollywood Hills. And this is a 1938 Neutra house on the left. And the woman who owns that house purchased the property where the swimming pool and that building in the background with the arch roof is situated. She wanted an adjacent house to the property where she could entertain guests. And that's a separate, complete unit for entertainment, barbecue in the kitchen, oven, and facilities for outdoor living and dining, plus a place for her children to play out in the open and also use the pool. It's a very exciting example how a 1938 house is added to by a 1988 architect. There's a close-up of the view up in the Santa Monica Hills, along the cliffs, along facing the ocean. And this is Schindler's 1935-36 house that he did. And I photographed this from my vest pocket camera. And again, the fates of architecture were kind to me because I went back in later years with my large camera. This is with my vest pocket Kodak. And today you can't take this photograph anymore from the street because the house is hidden by huge, full-grown trees. The only way you can show what's inside the patio space is to take a close-up, which doesn't show the whole house, but nonetheless, this is the only thing you can do nowadays. And this is Schindler's well-known house in the beach, Newport Beach in Southern California. Also done for the man for whom Neutra did the Lovell Health House. This is Lovell's Beach House. And it demonstrates the departure from two architects who were living and working in Vienna in the first part of this first 2 decades of the 20s and up until 1920. And how they moved to Southern California and departed in different directions from their architectural practice. This is Pierre Koenig's case study house for Arts and Architecture magazine. And this is the picture that also, together with the Richard Neutra house and the Kaufman house, these two photographs have become, according to what publishers tell me, the 2 most widely published architectural photographs of modern architecture in the history of publication. It's a fabulous story about the need to recognize, as I did the Neutra Kaufman house in Palm Springs, that there was some scene here which says what the spirit of architecture can produce. And if you want to introduce the public to architecture, you've got to create an image that makes the person want to live in this house. It's like Paul Goldberger, who was the architectural critic of the New York Times, said in his Sunday magazine article one day, if any image he's ever seen introduces to the world what modern architecture means, to live in a house up in the hills above Hollywood, California, what modern architecture really means, he said this one picture produces that image. And it's fascinating to realize that the public throughout the publication world, magazines, popular magazines, even Forbes, the business magazine, Harper's Bazaar, the fashion magazine, popular magazines, not just professional architectural magazines, have published this photograph. And it's something which we'll talk about later. We'll talk about how we began to reproduce our book on modernism. We'll come back to that later. This is another Pierre Koenig house, where he had run water up on the roof of the house to spill down on the left side from the scuppers, from the gutter pipes, and made a sparkling, cooling water effect in a little pond on the left in front of the house. And yet you can look in and through the house like an X-ray photograph. And this is another view of the same area to show you have two choices or three choices when photographing a house. Then Pierre Koenig also did another house, a new one, for one of his clients, where he used a double steel frame, which was the primary construction. And then, when the house is finished, this is how it looked. And you notice he didn't make a house of glass, because in Santa Monica Canyon, the winds come from the ocean late in the afternoon. It gets cold. You don't want too much glass. You want privacy because their house is next door. Carl Maston was another house where I don't think there's a person in the room who probably knows who Carl Maston is or was. He died a few years ago. Now this is a good point to demonstrate what Pierre Luigi and I wanted to do in our book on modernism, Rediscovered. Because this house is one of the houses we're using, showing Carl Maston's work. And Pierre Luigi, why don't you talk a little bit about this house and Carl's work and the purpose of our book?
Well, I have to say I was introduced to Julius' work through the Kaufman House, like everybody else, and I was lured to California probably by that image, and then later the Pierre Koenig House. And when I did this work, Julius was very aware of what was available in the archive. And the archive is an amazing resource of data. And to see this work completely left out of the history books, it was almost frightening because of the quality of the work, and because this is in this case Carl Maston represents one of the heroes on which someone like Frank Gehry came out of. Julius has been the photographer of Norwich Schindler and the Case Study House program, and the literature on that period has been focused exclusively on those characters. And there's a whole landscape of people that have been left out of that experience that Julius photographed, and it's in the archive, and it's the first time that this book is showing the amazing amount of work. And unfortunately, not all the work that was in the archive was able to make it in the book. But it's a hint for everybody to know that there is much more on that time, and also the role of photographer in general. Yeah.
Now, we'll go on quickly and come back to Pierre Luigi in a few more moments. I want to show you something else here. Benedict Taschen one day decided to do a book called Tausend Hund, 1,000 Dogs. The book just came out on the market, and he asked me, one of his editors asked me if I had some dog photographs. Well, I did, and matter of fact, I'm even thinking seriously becoming a dog photographer now, and rather than being an architectural photographer. I was photographing a house in Bel Air, California, and these two dogs lived in this little dog house next door to the main house. And they began to bark at me, and I said to them, hold your barking for a moment, I want to see who's living upstairs. Now I looked through that opening, there was a large Great Dane, beautiful dog lying asleep. He had just had lunch, so he was not going to stand up and bark. So I photographed this house, and I sent it to Life magazine in New York, and the editor loved the picture very much and published it. Then people wrote back to him letters to the editor asking, dear editor, we like the photograph of the two dogs, but where is the other dog? And you know, they had so many letters responding to this photograph. And again, whether it's a dog house or whether it's a human house, it points out the importance of, by the way, also, the house itself, that photograph, wasn't that great. It never was published. But everyone published the dog house. So the architect gets credit for a dog house. And you'd be surprised how many inquiries he received from people. If you have a great love for animals and do a good dog house for you, we'd like you to photograph a house for us. So he got new clients because of a doghouse photograph. So the moral of the story is, don't hesitate to do a good doghouse. And in Vienna, an architect named Richter, I think, designed, which we photographed just a few years ago, designed this new intermediate school, a middle school as it's called, all glass. Roof, walls, and then all of a sudden we come to another dog picture, which was published in the Taschen dog book. And I'm showing you this for another story purpose. Human beings all over the world have a problem of communication. And that's why we have wars. This is why we kill each other. Why a Muslim who may be a Serb, or contrary-wise, there may be another Muslim, another part of Yugoslavia, who doesn't believe in what the Serbian believe in, because even though they both be Muslims, so they kill each other. And they cut each other's throats. And then you go to Sri Lanka, and you find the other day also a very important person in Madrid was killed, assassinated. Throughout the world, people are not communicating. So when two dogs meet, they touch their noses together, and if they like each other, they wag their tails, they're happy, and they become friends. But if they don't, they growl and bark at each other, maybe bite, and then they run away. So they don't become friends. So the human being has to learn how to communicate. And one of the reasons of communication is, example, as shown here, this is Frank Gehry's first house, 1959. And you say, my goodness, this doesn't look like Frank Gehry's Bilbao, does it? It doesn't look like anything he's done these days. But Frank discovered early in his life, he had met Soriano and Schindler and Neutra. He began to say, oh, I don't want to study ceramics or pottery, which he was doing at the University of Southern California. And Professor Glenn Lukens was having a house done by Raphael Soriano, who later years published, designed my home and studio. And he came up to see the Glenn Lukens house under construction. He decided then and there, at the advice of Dr. Lukens, that perhaps since your form of pottery, he said, was so good to Frank Gehry, why don't you study architecture? And that day in 1952 or 53, Frank Gehry began to study architecture. And as you know, the history of his life, this is the beginning of a great career. And that's the interior of that house. It doesn't look much different from a Neutra or Schindler or Soriano house. But what a beginning. Soriano did the house here for one of his clients, a woman who's a musician, overlooking the Silver Lake where Richard Neutra lived at the time, way at the far end of the lake, as you see. And here's a view of the same room with the mountains in the background. And a woman who plays the piano, the concert pianist, she loved to have her piano, and she gave concerts for her friends. My own house by Soriano, steel framework, which gave us protection from all the earthquakes we've had since 1950 when we moved into the house. And this is the steel framework. Down the hills, the Hollywood Hills around my house. You may know the name Harwell Harris. He designed the house just over the top of my roof with that sloping roof down Woodrow Wilson Drive. And this is my interior. Soriano, when we furnished the house, refused to come into the house and sit on this furniture. You wouldn't believe the behavior of that man. He was a great friend. He allowed me to do certain things around the house which we felt we needed. But he said, throw out that junky furniture. That's no good. Look, the club chairs, by the way, are swivels. You can swing around and move them. the direction. If you want to talk to the good-looking girl next to you, you just swing your chair and all that. So anyhow, the couch is comfortable, everything is great. This is what makes modern architecture work. Therefore, under the circumstances, you ask the question, should an architect like Neutscher taking out furniture in the Maslin house I showed you before, should an architect say to a client, thou shalt not have that chair, it is no good, take it out. And Soriano never, ever sat on any of my furniture. That's the short story of a long story in his career. And the patio at the end of the living room is all screened in, so it keeps the insects and flies out. And it's a dark green lumite screen which breaks the light and glare. We have most of our meals outside in this patio. And it faces directly to the garden. And this is the view of the house as seen from my studio, which is right next door to the house. Frank Lloyd Wright and his house in the Hollywood Hills. The contrast between contemporary work, as we know, called international style, or Frank Lloyd Wright's museum in San Francisco, well, it's really not a museum, but it's a collection of fine art objects, which is a perfect example of the flexibility of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. There we go. This is the Barnesville Park House. By the way, those of you who plan someday in the foreseeable future to come to Hollywood, wait for another year because this house is being restored. It's going to be magnificently landscaped and not reconstructed. There was some earthquake damage in 1994. But wait a little while, and then you can call me on the phone and we'll take you there and let you see the house. The Arts and Architecture Case Study House Program. Representing this is a house by Edward Killingsworth. 3 houses called the Triad. 3 houses in La Jolla, California. Now this is important because some of the case study houses do represent a period of design work by Arts and Architecture magazine editor John Intenza. And this points out some of the aspects of the work that architects did. Now here's another house by the same architect, also a case study house, on a lot that was 30 feet wide, 10 meters wide. That's a small piece of land. And yet he built a solid wall on the very left side of the picture next to a neighbor's house. The house itself faces its own patio. It's 2 stories high. And this is really one of the best of all the Arts and Architecture case study houses. But it demonstrates why an architect who do the big, glamorous, expensive houses can also do a small 30-foot lot property and make a good lifestyle. And you're living in this house facing your own garden, also facing your own patio, without any fear of a lack of privacy. Now, at this point, I think it's important that Pierre Luigi points out how and why we selected the work of an architect by the name of Ray Kreitz, C-R-I-T-E-S. Ray Kreitz was an architect in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in the middle of the United States. And he created remarkable designs, and relatively unknown. So you wonder, and you ask the question, why and how did a man with the great talent that he had fail to attract attention until the later part of his life? So Pierre.
Well, this is one of the examples of Ray Kreitz that we have in the book, and we have several of these buildings. And of all the people that are in the book, probably he's one of the most forgotten architects. And he practiced for a long time in Iowa, and then went to Argentina, then came back to the United States. He sort of had a very erratic life. And although many of his houses were awarded by the local chapter of the AIA, which is the American Institute of Architects, he never really made through architectural history books. There are a few notes of David Gephardt here and there, but nothing really substantial. And this house was published in House and Home exclusively for his structural merits of these umbrellas. But
This is interesting.
yes, and there were several pieces that were interesting for us. All of the books, all of the projects that we have in the book were discussed with Julius, and in this case, the sky that was extremely important for this particular house is as a central plan, and it's a sort of a blend of a broiler and frankly Lloyd of a wing spread. And somehow, for us, it was really stunning the fact that this house was never really looked at. And I was able to write about it because I found also the abstract of what the house was about, because of the close association that Julius had with Ray Price. He, for a long time, became the photographer of Price and McConnell. And we probably have around 10 buildings about it.
There's no.
You want to say something about it?
No, it's not in the house.
Yeah, we have a few more interiors, and again, the house was primarily looked at for the umbrellas that they were having, the structural umbrellas, and it's actually a remarkable piece of architecture. Even some of the things can be dated, but nevertheless, it's still worth being looked at.
Ray Price also developed a wonderful idea. As you know, in your climate in northern United States, or certainly the climate in Germany, and when you go to Bremen, or even north of Cologne, in wintertime the weather becomes very cold, and you wish you had more of Southern California's warm air. Now, this is a house of Ray Kreitz, who became a professor of architecture at Iowa State University in the 1960s. Now, the glass enclosed structures on the right side, you see those 3 elements on the right side, and there's 4 elements on the left side behind the chimney. These are glass cages outside the living room, which has sliding doors opening to the outdoor part of the house. When Ray Kreitz and his wife were professors at Iowa State University, left their home in the morning at 8 o'clock, they closed the sliding doors of the living room and had draperies installed after we took this photograph. The draperies were closed, meaning that the sun during the day would beat down on those glass cages, and the heat was stored. Even though it was 23 or 25 degrees Fahrenheit outside, that is cold, below freezing. Then when they came home in the late afternoon, at 5 o'clock, on a cold, cold winter night, or autumn night, they opened the draperies and the sliding doors, and all the sunlight that was captured, the heat that was captured inside those 2 cages, flooded into the house. And they lit a fire in the fireplace, which also had coils of copper tubing below the fireplace, and there's water being pumped throughout the house, and the fireplace was heating the house by the fact that water was being circulated throughout the house. Pure solar energy, and surprising what a pioneer effort that was so early in the history of pioneer solar energy utilization. Ray Kreitz also did a speech arts auditorium building in Iowa State University, and this auditorium was the site of one of New York Philharmonic Symphony Orchestra concerts when they travel around the country, which they did every year. And the auditorium is one of the most striking, beautiful auditoriums ever designed anywhere in this country, in the United States, and certainly around the world. And the reason why I show this as an example of Ray Kreitz's flexibility is the fact that When the New York Philharmonic Symphony traveled around the country, art critics and music critics of the New York Times and other papers in New York traveled with the auditorium to the auditoriums where the concerts were taking place. And the art and the music critics in New York announced publicly that of all the concerts that the New York Philharmonic Orchestra played at, this auditorium was the best acoustical relationship to the music that they ever had found anywhere in the United States. And yet, Ray Kreitz is not an acoustical engineer. The suggestion here is to say, isn't there some way that architects, no matter what you do, whether it's a public library, a church, or a concert hall, is there a way that architects can learn more about acoustics? It's a neglected art in the architectural education. I think it's important that architectural students someday may want to do or may get a commission to do an auditorium. Why shouldn't architectural students go on field trips to study auditoriums, go to churches, go to libraries? And churches are one of the worst offenders because most churches have horrible acoustics. You can't understand what the pastor is saying. And some people say to me, gee, it's so bad in my church, I think I'll go play golf instead of go to church. Ray Kreitz also did his own house, which was published in Life magazine many years ago. So he finally got some recognition. Ray Cappy is another architect in Southern California. This is his own house, surrounded by a grove of beautiful trees. And this is his outdoor dining area, which is really an enclosed room. And I had meals here years ago when the house was new. And it's a delightful place to sit and talk and have a meal with just 2 people or 4 people, or add another table if they did from time to time when they had a larger group of visitors. He did the small house, also in the same neighborhood. This shows modern architecture in a way that the public would like to see and would enjoy, and that you have a feeling that you can live in a house like this and enjoy it. But most modern houses were just glass boxes with no privacy, no comfort, no places to put furniture. And therefore, it behooves all of us to begin to understand more about photography of architecture. This is a scene in Brasilia. And I took this photograph to portray how, whereas in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago, large buildings are crowded on top of each other. There's no space between them. And yet in Brasilia, with these magnificent skies and wonderful spaces, you can see how, with photography of this kind, you are invited to participate in the development of design of a community. This is the way the ideal urban development should be and could be developed without crowding buildings on top of each other, even though those are all government buildings in Brasilia. And then here you got the cathedral by Niemeyer, Oscar Niemeyer. And the cathedral is a very daring structure, but look at the interior, all glass. And this building has magnificent acoustics. And Niemeyer was a champion. Even though these are hard marble surfaces and concrete and glass, the way the building was designed, the acoustics were wonderful. Another example of why modern architecture has succeeded in some areas and other areas has failed. Because the architects of this house in Washington State, in the northern United States, the Northwest, use small windows, yet the views are spectacular. They look out onto Puget Sound, towards the ocean, a northwestern part of Washington State, using redwood. And or in contrast, here's a modern house an architect did for himself, Alan Morris. He wanted to have a house which has a great view and privacy, a lot of trees, so the comfort's there and the landscaping is beautiful. But this is the kind of modern house that most people are afraid of. They don't want to have that much open space, even though the relationship indoors and outdoors is perfect. There's a house in Palm Springs, California by an architect named Stuart Williams. This too is an example of good architecture and relating to a garden outside, and you look up towards the mountains behind Palm Springs. This to me is one of the more important pictures that we have in our book. An architect by the name of Raul Garduno, who is living now in Cabo San Lucas in Mexico. He's working there. But Pierluigi, what do you think? Why do we have this house in our book?
Well, I mean, this is I guess one of the reasons why we have this house is because it continues a theme which is was developed since the 40s, which is the relationship between indoors and outdoors. And the Southern California climate is so generous that essentially there are really no 4 seasons, but it's just one season. Yes. And as such, we have used some of these. At least we have 2 examples of his work. But again, many of these buildings were not published in professional magazines, but found their way in the Sunday supplement of the Los Angeles Times or magazine. And it was amazing to see the resources that that particular newspaper invested in supporting modern architecture. And it was very much a political project in which Julius was one of the pillars, and together with writers of the caliber of Dan McMasters and Esther McCoy and others. And this, probably more than arts and architecture, spread the message of modernism among a rich clientele. So it became a source of breeding new clients and commissioning more modern architecture.
The reason too, as we can expand the thoughts about this house, is that although Raul Garduno had a very happy client, he only got 1 or 2 other clients in the history of his life because he didn't have the exposure, although he did have a few publications, but nothing of any great national significance, and he became unknown. It was really unknown. However, he had friends in Mexico, Baja, Lower California, and he moved down there where he's working today, building condominiums. But the tragedy is, here's a contemporary house of great significance and comfort. It has a sufficient openness, and yet the landscaping on the left ensures a house of privacy. There's no house next door, so it doesn't invade their privacy. But it points out in architecture the danger of having a house which is too open, too much glass, unless you are certain that the clients will be protected and have a comfortable, beautiful house in which to live. You know the work of, You know the work of Charles Eames? This is his case study house. He did for Arts and Architecture magazine. And here's another view. All the material in this house was acquired by Eames by working directly with developers of industrial building materials. Steel glass windows, framework of steel. The panels are also prefabricated. The house was built at a very modest cost because of the material that went into it. He wanted to show that you can not prefabricate a house, but you can go to an industrial company and buy individual pieces, literally. And out of this came this house, which is very satisfactory. There's Ray and Charles Eames. This has become a very important photograph because both have passed away in recent years. But it demonstrates them living in a very comfortable, friendly house. But you see, even the roof, in the top above the right-hand corner of the picture, is all steel. Fabrication, piece by piece. The house was erected at a very quick time at a very low price. And the concentration on the part of Ray Eames was to use decoration. She had a great collection, she and Charles Eames, of objects they picked up in their travels around the world. Now, here's an object lesson I thought we'd talk about for a few moments. That's about those architects and people who govern the cleaning and operation of a swimming pool. In the morning, when the attendants prepare the pool for the hotel visitors, this is a hotel in Honolulu, Hawaii, everything is lined up with military precision. The shades are squared away, everything is ready for the customers to come out to go swimming. And what happens? The first patients come out. The first thing they do is to move the furniture around. And then after a while, more come out. And this is another addition. And we asked a question. As a matter of fact, I talked about this with Frank Gehry one day, because he had seen this photograph series in one of my lectures. He said, Julius, this is exactly why I broke away from the straight line in my architecture. I'm using material. Look at what I'm doing. I'm avoiding, he said, the straight line. And for people to do this by themselves, to avoid the regimentation of strict line, what's wrong with it? Something moving on the projector or something? Or is that an earthquake? Now, look how far away this is from the discipline of the straight line that we saw in the first photograph. And finally, these are people getting a nice case of skin cancer. All this is part of architecture and discipline. So Frank Gehry said to me one day when we were talking about this, he said, my God, just had to think. He saw the girl on the right-hand side, two girls on the right-hand side. Their bodies were all distorted. What's happening? He said, these people are not really comfortable. They're getting too much sunlight. They're not really enjoying the pool. They should be in the pool swimming. That one body with that man, or that's a woman face down. You can study this picture and do a whole story, but forget about it. This is the cover of our book. And tell me, Pierre Lévy,
Well,
you can analyze this because you and I were looking at these photographs together, making the selection. Why did Benedict Taschen decide this book with Peter Gersel, the editor? Why did they make this book, this picture, the cover?
well, actually, that was our suggestion. We had 2 or 3 possible candidates, and Julius always talks about having eye stoppers, those pictures that capture the attention of people that are inundated by images. So why would someone look at this picture? And in a sense, of all these pictures, is one of those that capture some of the qualities probably of the Kaufman House or the case study House 22. There are some specific features that Julius uses in his photographs, and whenever there is a sort of a structural miracle, so to speak, he puts loads at the end of those structural miracles and make that even more daring. And then you can see in this case that the coastline is right underneath the cantilever, so you never lose the depth of the photograph. And then, I mean, this whole picture could be analyzed in terms of gender studies, because there's a woman behind a man that looks at the binocular that goes outside. And it shows a section of the house. And this house was published, this is the cover picture of the Sunday supplement of the Los Angeles Examiner, which is a publication, a newspaper that doesn't exist anymore. And it was wonderfully photographed and had an amazing spread. And I believe Dan McMaster wrote about it, and it was very, very seductive. And I was able to recover the existence of the house exclusively through the archive. And So Taschen gave this wonderful homage to this house, which is the third house of Richard Spencer, who was an engineer with a structural obsession. He was always wanted to develop hillside housings, and so every house was an attempt to break out of structural convention. So there are two more examples out of it.
It points out too, which is very important, and you'll see in this picture of a house. Can you just tilt the projector down a little bit, please? Tilt the projector down a little bit.
Yes, because the house is above.
There we go. Now the reason for showing this photograph is that the cliff, geologically, which shows above where the car is driving by on the highway, that cliff was very unstable, and the engineer who designed this structural site with the architect, well actually Richard Spencer was not an architect, he was just a designer. He didn't have a real professional training, but the engineer cantilevered the house 18 feet, almost 6 meters, out from the cliff so that the owners could see the view of the ocean that you saw in the previous photograph. Let's go to Palm Springs again, because Albert Frey built this house for Raymond Loewy, the industrial designer, right in the heart of the desert, not too far away from the Neutra Kaufman house. But it demonstrates in architecture and in photography, you don't have to show the entire house. Most people who see this photograph say, oh, the desert is beautiful, I'd like to live here. And they have to see very little of the house, but you have the living room floor with carpeting in the foreground, and the swimming pool penetrates inside the living room. And if you're not careful, you'll fall in the pool with a martini glass in your hand. And this is the Chemosphere house by John Lautner. And this is the house that Benedict Taschen purchased a couple of years ago. It's not far away from my house in the Hollywood Hills. And it's built in a place where John Lautner had a client, and John and the client did not want to excavate the hill and cause landslides, so they dug a huge caisson in the hillside where the land was stable and built a 6-foot diameter steel concrete structure to support the entire house. And the reason for that is that they didn't have any expensive excavation, and as a result, from inside the house, which is built on the top of that concrete column, you saw the mountains in the distance, the San Fernando Valley, and it's a magnificent view both day and night. And I can tell you one thing, if you have a martini or wine or a stronger whiskey in your hand, the flavor is very much enhanced. And John Lautner was very flexible. This is a house he built along the ocean in Santa Monica. And the portraits he used were laminated wood beams. But inside the house, look what that structure it makes it able for John to expand the space with a floating ceiling and get a magnificent view of the ocean. A house over above Silver Lake, also near the Neutra compounds. The house he did overlooking the lake. But look at the indoor-outdoor expression where you can get a complete feeling of architectural significance, and the house is not at all devoid of privacy and still a magnificent view. And at this house that Lautner did is again showing the flexibility of his design, overlooking the Newport Beach Bay along the Pacific coastline. But the opposite of the view shows a great sliding door combination to demonstrate how each architect can, if he studies materials and techniques. Lautner correctly observed the potential of a wonderful view, so he created a sliding door out of segments of glass, about 2 feet, 30 inches wide, But the glass is sealed together with a certain epoxy adhesive material, making it flexible so that the sliding door, as you see, is curved. And the door can be pushed open around the side of the building out of the way, so that people have an open-air view of the ocean and the sailboats and still have the privacy of their own house. Another house in the Malibu, Santa Monica beach area, all glass. And here we go to Oklahoma. Herb Green did what is called a prairie chicken house. It looks like a wild bird that lives in the prairies in mid-United States. And this we photographed for Life magazine because they were just intrigued by the remarkable use of wood and redwood shingles and aluminum. And for those who are seeking privacy, here's something which you all should visit. In the middle of the Thessaly Plain, the central part of Greece, about 125 kilometers north of Athens, there's a massive rock formation. Many steep cliffs where monks in centuries past, seeking privacy, freedom of worship, escaped from the domination of other peoples, and discovered that they could gain access to the top of these rocks and build their monasteries. And in this area called Kalimbaka, there are now many of these monasteries which are still occupied, but each of maybe 3 or 4 of them at least have magnificent Byzantine art collections. So please, those of you, since you're right here in Europe, not more than a couple hours, 3 hours away by flight to Athens, you can drive up to these places. They're open to the public. They now have ski-type chairlifts on the other side of the mountain, each rock, and you can go up and visit these monasteries and see a great collection of Byzantine art. Now I'll give you a contrast though. Here is in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, a construction by architect Edward Giddings. He has 8 villas, one above another, each with a swimming pool, which pours over the edge of the pool to the neighboring one down below, and the water's pumped back up and filtered. But here, with this kind of climate, you have no need for glass. The rooms are all outdoor spaces, and the weather is temperate. But again, how many architects have ever done this? There are many architects in Mexico, but no one has ever, until the time that Giddings designed this place, ever executed a cliff-facing group of 8 villas, one above another, to take advantage of the climate. And yet you wonder about architecture. Where in the career of an architectural student can he ever be exposed to learn the value of respect for climate and nature? Now, can we change that, please? Before we go back, we'll have another tray. Here we go. Now we're in the state of Minnesota, northern United States. This is a house designed by Bruce Goff, who was a former apprentice for Frank Lloyd Wright way back in the 1930s. Then he began to do work of this kind, which was composed of native rock right from the prairies. And he sealed them up and made a fireplace, and it's an entirely different structure that denies description. Yet it turned out to be a very important house. And yet another form of design. Here is a place called the House of the Book. It's a religious institution where the architect decided not to have windows, but all the rooms inside, they have classrooms. And here is a classroom in the sanctuary in the foreground. All the rooms are round. The architect thought, why shouldn't we have a series of rounded classrooms? And reflects the outside solid walls. And the lighting comes from skylights in the ceiling. And then speaking of sunlight, here we have the lobby of the El Camino Hotel in Mexico City. And the light we get on the ceiling, which is a very complex structure, was exposed because the light was coming from a wall outside in the patio at the entrance side of the hotel, reflecting pure daylight to cover the entire space. And another example of architecture that William Pereira's office designed, the Transamerica building in San Francisco. But I couldn't resist in photographing this house, this structure, to include the last century remarkable building with a rounded front, in contrast to the steepness of the Transamerica Triangle. However, if you look at the tall tower, you look at the right side of the tower, and you see that strange concrete protrusion. What is that? It turns out when the plans were prepared for the Transamerica building, and the plans were given to the oldest elevator company, they said, Mr. Pereira, or his assistant, how can we get elevators up on the top floors because the building narrows to a small footage and there's no room for an elevator? So you'll have to expand the floors on the right side of the tower. And that's where the elevators are exposed now. Otherwise, if they had not executed this plan this way, the building could not have been built. Now here again, in architectural education, at what point is it the responsibility of an architect of a major firm to design a building which he probably was having a nightmare one night and decided in his dreams to build a triangular building? You should have talked to Mr. Otis, the elevator company man, first. It's a long story, but I'll tell you, this is what I observe after my 64 years of being with architects and working as an observer as well as a photographer. I say, well, gee, it's a beautiful photograph. The building is a milestone. Everyone in San Francisco knows it because it's the tallest building in the area. But on the other hand, again, a man bought this piece of property. It's a cliff above Newport Beach. Newport Beach and Balboa Beach area in Southern California, oceanfront properties. The man loved that property so much he hired an architect to build on the face of a cliff. And look at it. It's supported by two 12 by 12 inch columns and a horizontal beam resting on top of those columns. But the worst part of all, I don't even know if the house is still there because it's built right above 3 major earthquake faults. Think of living here and you wake up 3 o'clock in the morning, your house is shaking. Good night. Then the other extreme in Southern California, another man had a vertical piece of property, and this architect was wiser. He built his house on steel protrusions, cantilevered over the side of the hill, very much like the first picture we showed you with the cover of our book. The city of Los Angeles permitted the architect to expand the beams that you see underground under this wall into the street which is next door, providing he would restore the street to its original condition. So the beams protrude the house over a cliff, And when it's finished, which I didn't show you any of the photographs, I don't intend to, it makes you dizzy to be in the house. But it shows you what length people go in Southern California to take advantage of the view. This is the church, the Crystal Cathedral, for Dr. Robert Schuller. Philip Johnson was the architect. The building on the left is the Tower of Hope. It's the office building that Neutra designed for the Crystal Cathedral for Robert Schuller. So there's a comparison between the work of Neutra and Philip Johnson. But the secret of this church is its openness. And the secret of design was not Philip Johnson, but a very enlightened Reverend Schuller, who said to me one day up at the tower when we're looking at the property, someday I'm going to have a building which I'll call the Crystal Cathedral. And I want all glass. And when he commissioned Philip Johnson to do this church, he expressed his feelings very specifically about the shape and the openness. He said, I want you, Philip Johnson, to design me a church where we can feel the presence of God. He's going to look down upon us while we're worshiping, and we want light to come through from all sides of the building. And it's a tremendously complex structure, but it works beautifully. And incidentally, those of you, regardless of your religious feelings, if you ever come to Southern California, come around Easter time or Christmas. They have great pageants here. But even a normal service on Sunday, to go into this cathedral, it makes you, even though you may be an atheist, you may say, thank God I'm an atheist, because you come in and see great architecture. And at the same time, I had an opportunity, because a church magazine, a religious magazine, asked me one day to do an article about architecture of churches. They had seen my photographs of the Reverend Schuller Crystal Cathedral. They said to me, can you do a little story of architecture to show how many different forms a church can take? So here I am on a ski trip from Munich to Kitzbühel, Austria. And out of the window at 70 miles an hour, I spotted during a snowstorm this wonderful church standing on the side of a mountain. And this picture was the one that the church magazine used on the cover. And I used it for a Christmas card that year. 70 miles an hour with a little 35mm camera during a storm. But it points out again, instead of going to sleep or reading the latest copy of some special magazine or whatever, you spend your time enjoying the scenery. That's where you travel for anyhow. But I'm very proud of this church photograph. As I am of this bank in Oklahoma. The architects were asked by the client, please give us something a little different. We didn't want to have a simple brick building. So they designed these flying saucer disc-like shapes supported by single columns of steel, and people all over Oklahoma came to see this crazy moon rocket kind of building. Their deposits increased by 300% by the daring nature of this architecture. And the result turned out to be that the clients expanded their church in other parts of Oklahoma, and the architectural firm began to do a whole series of new buildings based on this one structure. They had the courage to not fail the architect's requirement, the client's requirement, to build this out of glass and some kind of strange shape. The clients didn't really know anything specifically like Reverend Schuller did in the Crystal Cathedral. But in this case, the architects had been thinking about flying saucers. And this is what came out. One of our architecture case study houses here. We were photographing this to show how people could live in a modern house. We had a professional model, and the editor of the magazine, the LA Times editor, was there. So we posed him for a picture to bringing a little sex into the issue. And this sells modern architecture. As this does too. This is the home that the two brothers, Green and Green, photographed craftsman type buildings out of wood and shingles in Southern California, but they paid great attention to detail. Look at the nature of a skillful, elegant use of wood craftsmanship. And again, this is another form of contemporary architecture. Yeah, that was done in the 1890s. But here's my favorite. This is called architecture. And I prayed one day that a massive storm would come and blow the house down the hill. It's strange. Who in the right mind, and I don't hesitate to say this publicly, who in the right mind as an architect will do this kind of house? It's disgraceful. What you're doing with the client's money. It's not postmodern, it's not modern, it's not nothing. Know-how. Another problem architects have, and it's quite different from the previous photograph. What's this picture doing here? Well, I'm in Guam, the island of Guam, with some architects. This is a new library they just finished. They want to enter it in the American Library Association annual competition for architects' design of libraries. But it was foggy, because it had rained the night before. It was dull, the sky was overcast. And being a Boy Scout, I knew all about looking at weather maps. I could tell whether the weather was going to be good tomorrow or stormy. But I looked at the weather chart in the newspaper that morning, and this storm that brought the rain and clouds was going to depart the next day, and here's the next day. The architects didn't want to stay, and I said, please, I know it's going to be sunny tomorrow. So we wet the pavement down, washed the dirt, and this is one of the back part of the library, which helped to win an award from the library competition, plus the interior photographs that we did. But I'm showing these two photographs primarily to show if the weather's bad, study the maps, and spend another day, which we did, and we got that picture. One of Richard Neutra's early apprentices went up to northern United States in the state of Idaho, did this rather exciting, simple, but well-oriented house, looking out towards the Lake Coeur d'Alene in the distance. And even though the woman, a beautiful blonde woman that the man who owned the house married, she didn't know where the eggs were in the house. She didn't know how to cook. But I found, with the help of the owner of the house, where the refrigerators were, and we dressed the set with elements as if we're going to make a scrambled egg or something. But I'm showing you this because it's a house that was designed by a brilliant architect, taking advantage of the view, and even though the woman didn't know how to cook, we made a good photograph of the kitchen. But in contrast to this, John Lautner one day did a house for a client, and she was a gourmet cook. She said to John Lautner, "John, don't touch the kitchen. That's my private domain. I'm going to design the kitchen myself," and this is what came out. Why? Because she liked to have her pots and pans hanging from the ceiling with hooks. She had an old gas stove, and she had her wash rags, dishcloths hanging there in the front of the stove to dry. She said, "I want everything just the way it is, the way I live and cook." I put the dishcloths there to dry in the heat of the stove. So don't move away, she told me. And look at the pots and things all around the kitchen. It's a fire hazard, but she makes wonderful meals. Now, the element in my life came in a trip to Japan, where this is an architect who had designed his own traditional Japanese house. He cooked, as you can see, on the coals of a brazier, a fire, and cooked everything on a wok. And if you want to taste good food, you can visit this architect, Matsumoto, in Yokohama, Japan. I'll give you his address. If you go to Japan, he'll cook you a meal. Another architect was more of the school of architecture. Buckminster Fuller developed the geodesic dome. They had this wonderful house floating on the side of a hill in the Hollywood Hills. Frank Lloyd Wright, on the other hand, did this house overlooking Hollywood, the Freeman House. Schindler did a daring house on the side of a hill, quite different from anything else he ever did. And the front of the house has a wonderful roof line because Schindler expanded the interior spaces above the garages and above the living room of the house to create this wonderful example of not conforming with the glass box kind of architecture. A.Q. Jones, the architect who was the dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Southern California, designed this house. Now, in contrast, one of the problems of modern architecture, most architects would have made the glass wall on this side of the house, even though someone would build a house next door someday. But the architects, with the clients, decided that the view they wanted of the ocean would be best seen from upstairs from one of the rooms, looking out to the ocean. Again, a solid wall on the left where you'll be normally facing the clients, the new clients for somebody next door. But we dressed the furniture down below in some flowers and plants, and small windows on the left side facing the view towards up the coastline. But I posed my assistant and the family dog down on the beach, and without them, the picture would have been useless. But here you get a feeling of somebody living and enjoying the beach in Santa Monica, California. A man by the name of Paul Laszlo came from Stuttgart, Germany, began to do houses in his own interpretation of Southern California architecture. He became very successful. Now, here we're going back to nature again. We're photographing a ski lodge up in the state of Colorado, the Rocky Mountains. And towards the end of the season, but we were there a small period of time doing a little skiing and also to photograph the ski lodge. It's a big apartment, hotel complex. But the trees in Colorado are aspen trees. They're like your, pull out the trees that occupy much of the area around Berlin and central Germany. And the aspens, when the leaves fall off in winter, are barren. Now notice the cloud shadow on the top of the mountains above the bare aspen tree area. And I observed the shadows. And the architect was with me, said, matter of fact, that's his place down below, near where that shadow is in the foreground. He said to me, gee, it's too bad we don't have something we can make the aspen trees darker, because the color is very much blending with the color of the apartment, the hotel. So I waited and I said, well, watch the cloud shadow as it comes down, as the clouds move across the sky. The cloud shadow will come down, and as I spoke, this is what happened. The cloud shadow covered the bare hill, and it created a magnificent contrast of the shape of the building outlined against the shadow, whereas in the previous picture, you had no way of really delineating the form of the building. It's the responsibility of the architect and the photographer to appreciate nature and go on to creating this wonderful image. Now, my knowledge of German came in handy here, because when I came into this restaurant for lunch, overlooking the church area of Salzburg, Austria, I saw the view, and we would just come in to get a table, and I raised my camera. I was shooting this with a 35mm wide-angle lens. And as I raised the camera, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was the Mayor D. He said, "Mein Herr, das ist verboten." And I made believe I didn't know German. I said, "Jawohl, mein Herr, danke," and I raised the camera and took the picture. And of course he couldn't say anything but give me a table and enjoy my lunch. But the point I was making is don't hesitate to photograph. It's like when I refused when Mr. Neutra didn't want me to photograph that wonderful first picture of the Kaufman House at night. He tried to say this is verboten also, and I didn't say you're welcome. I just went ahead and shot the picture. So I did the same thing here, and this picture appeared on the restaurant magazine cover in Austria. Why? Because I didn't obey the law, so-called, of the Mehdi. They didn't want pictures taken of the building for fear of violating the privacy of their clients. No one cared. They're busy eating. Story of my life. Now, what am I doing here in Zurich, Switzerland? I was here to photograph this new department store display window, and also the interior of the department store. And I got there early, and the owner hadn't opened the store yet, and this woman observed through the peephole in the canvas to break the sun, which would fade the ordinary garments inside the window in the morning. And she was busy looking in through the hole. However, what happened? I just stood there and thought, well, I'll take her picture. It's a curious little composition. But suddenly, other women came around. And they said, wonder what that woman knows that we don't know. It's fascinating. Now, what's an architectural photographer or a dog photographer, which I'll become another time? What am I doing here? Why? Because I'm going to photograph this store. But I'm not going to waste my time. I'm going to enjoy the company of all these women. But look what comes out. It brings enjoyment to all of us. And then another example of photography responsibility. By the way, this has nothing to do with our book. It does in a way, but our book on modernism rediscovered. But what I'm trying to say with Pierre Luigi is let's confront problems and situations. Here I'm on assignment to photograph a rather attractive post office building in Southern California. And by the way, to those photographers, a few may be here, and architects, don't try to tell a photographer that you should photograph this building at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because this is what you get. Architects are the worst people who know direction of the sky and the sun. I wouldn't want them to guide me on a trip around the world. Okay, so fortunately I have in my equipment a polarizing screen. It's like a pair of lenses that you wear in the sunlight, where you wear the polarized lenses that breaks the glare of the sun. So with a lens on my camera, this scene, which is useless, becomes this. Just polarizing the light. And it's a simple lens you can put on your 35mm cameras, and you can avoid any problems of photographing. It cuts out the glare. It's wonderful for taking pictures of the ocean or the sky or the mountains. And then the other thing I'm trying to show here is the flexibility of design. Now, many people do not like erratic kind of forms. Now, Pierre Luigi, I thought in this instance, we discussed this while we're selecting pictures, and yet this architect, Richard Dorman, was fairly well known, but never achieved status of a successful nationally known or internationally known architect. I don't think there's a person in Europe who knows the name Richard Dorman. And what happened here, Pierre Luigi?
Well, actually, the first time I heard about Richard Dorman was in the book of Rainer Barham, the architectural photocologist. There was the picture of the Art Seidenbaum residence.
Yes.
And then he disappeared somewhere in Texas. So somehow he drew himself out of the Los Angeles scene. And being in Los Angeles was an opportunity to be exposed to clientele and publicity. And also, this particular statement that doesn't conform to what he was doing in previous years. And it seemed like I would think it was taken during the 70s, this picture, right?
Yes.
Yeah, something like that. And so maybe historians didn't find a continuity in his work to make textual statements about his career. So probably that's why he disappeared.
Well, essentially, too, Pierre Luigi, this is one of the very few erratic forms that Dorman ever did. And that he was able to make this series of triangles was very controversial. And yet we're including this because it does demonstrate the flexibility of architecture and the responsibility. The clients, in this case, who were standing there on the deck, liked what he was doing. They wanted something that would stand out because they're living on the top of a mountainside in Southern California above Beverly Hills. And they liked the idea of these triangular forms because the woman is a painter in her own right, and she liked controversial forms. And speaking of forms, look at the contrast. Albert Frey's house in Palm Springs, all of aluminum. The circular element on the top is his bedroom. It's a circular bedroom with windows designed to break this angle of the sunlight in summer and in winter. And yet Ray Cappy, another architect who's not very well known, although he has a book just being published, but again, he's not, and yet he's talented enough, in our estimation, to be acclaimed. He's a very brilliant architect. And here's the same house, a different angle. Look at the simplicity of forms. And here's a house in Punta del Este in South America. Again, the boldness of the architecture, the simple masonry material, break the winds which blow overlooking the La Plata area of the bay between Argentina and Uruguay. But the forms are not controversial compared to that triangular house. But the choice lies with the clients and the architects. And one thing which is very controversial is, is the solution to the world-famous Getty Center that Richard Meyer designed. Richard Meyer claimed that he had 185 conditions placed upon him by the people in the adjacent hillside homes in West Los Angeles, California, and by the actual clients of the committee representing the Getty people. And other architects and lay people would say to, and they did say this publicly to Richard Meyer, then why, if you didn't want to use all that complex material, the travertine rock and the complex forms, why did you accept the contract? He was very honest. He said, this project ultimately cost $1 billion. That's a lot of marks or a lot of shillings or whatever your component of finances are here. So would you give up a $1 billion project? So this went ahead and became famous because from the hills overlooking this area of the Hollywood Hills, Santa Monica Hills, you get magnificent views of the climate. And way in the distance on the right, for example, you see the city of Los Angeles when it's not a smoggy day. Way in the distance for 50 and 40 miles away. But the architecture is very weak. I'll say this publicly. On the other hand, being weaned in my life with the contemporary architecture of the 50s and 40s, this is the Water and Power Department, which provides water and electricity to Los Angeles. A straightforward view of the building by Albert Martin. Yet on the other hand, the architect's favorite view is this picture taken at twilight to demonstrate the sharpness and beauty of a well-balanced architectural photograph where the lights in the building are shown late in the afternoon before it gets dark, and the quality of the sky and the quality of light penetrating the glass of the building represents the real true form of this architecture. Now, I thought we'd visit Potsdamer Platz last year, a year and a half ago, and I was shocked by this horrible Tower of Babel mass of masonry and glass and structure. This is nearing completion of the towers of the Sony buildings and the Mercedes building. It's a frightful thing. It's almost as bad as that house I wanted to slide down the hill I showed you earlier. But this, to me, worries me. You know, the billions of dollars worth of buildings going up in Potsdamer Platz. What was in the thinking of the architects of things? piling things together so horribly. And Potsdamer Platz used to be a very beautiful place, because I remember it from way back years ago. And look what man has done to what could have been a great solution. This is a companion I had while photographing a house in northern Washington State. That's Henry, the owner's dog, who kept me while I was photographing the house. I have a wide-angle lens on my 35mm camera, so I shot the dog and went on for something else. And this is the story of my life, the end of our adventure. And for those of you who have time or questions, we'd like to have a discussion with Pierre Luigi and I. We can continue talking more about elements of our lives and why we did our books. Or, if not, thank you very much. Appreciate your visit with me and Pierre Luigi. And perhaps you'll have an opportunity to talk with us a little later. And I do thank you very much for your great attention. Thank you.
Mr. Shulman, thank you very much. Maybe there are some questions. Jennifer.
Yeah. I'm particularly interested in your photographs that, rather than being typical photographs of buildings and of architecture, are photographs that have people in them, and where you've used the interior or the architecture itself as a sort of stage set for what looks almost like a scenario that you've set up. And I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what goes through your head when you are setting up these scenarios, and why you do it, or what this idea behind the sale of modern architecture is, or was at the time.
Well, your question is very timely. First, by the way, can we get the projections to turn off the power before my slide burns up?
Just pull the plug.
Pull the plug.
On the stand.
There you go. To those who show 35mm slides, by the way, in your homes when you take a trip somewhere, don't bore you. It's bad enough that I keep you for 2 hours or more myself, but at least I have pretty pictures to show you. But don't bore your clients and your friends with leaving a projector on for a half hour while you're telling them your adventures, because that's the worst thing you can do for 35mm slides. Anyhow, your question, you all probably heard, about how and why I take my great photographs. I don't say that. People tell me they're great. I believe them. Okay, now, I'll give you an example how we work. The day before yesterday, no, it was yesterday. I lose time. I've been gone for 2 weeks or so from home. I was asked by the Die Zeit magazine newspaper people in Berlin, instead of interviewing me in a traditional interview that newspapers make for celebrities and others, they're going to give me a chance to be taken around Berlin to 5 different locations. They wanted to see how the great Shulman would look at these wonderful new buildings in Berlin. So they picked me up. One of them had a 35mm automatic camera, which the average tourist would use. And then we visited some locations. The purpose was I would show the editor how and where and why I would stand to take a photograph. And one of the locations they were taking me to was the home of the President of Germany, which was a very high security location, but a very striking oval-shaped building. It wasn't completely round. And I described to the representative of the government who took us around the building why and how I would take the photograph, as you asked in your question. I said, first I want to locate a spot in the building where the good sunlight was showing the form of the building. It was black masonry structure, so a lot of glass, and beautiful trees, park-like setting. And I said, let's start walking. There were 5 of us in our group. Let's start walking around the building. And we went from one direction towards the east and towards the west. And suddenly, as we came around the curve of the building, I observed a beautiful little pond of water, like a natural lake, a small lake. I asked the attendant, the representative, oh, this is a beautiful place. Can we go on the other side of the water? There was a park there. He said, oh yes, there's a path. So he showed us how to go around. We walked around the building, around the path, and I found the other side of the pond because I knew that the building, naturally being a pond of clear water, would reflect the building. So I stopped at a place where we not only saw the full width and height of the building, but the entire building was mirroring, reflecting in the water. And I said, this is the one picture that shows the entire form of the building. It shows its reflection pictorially in the water, and everyone likes water, and everyone likes reflections. I said to the editor, now, if I'm taking one picture of this government building, this is the one picture. I took one snap, period. That was all I took. People say, well, shouldn't you bracket your exposure, take 2 or 3 to be sure? I said, look, I've been doing this for 64 years. Why can't I be sure with one picture? Matter of fact, Benedict Taschen, our publisher, calls me one-shot Shulman. Why? Because I asked the photographer who was with us, who was taking pictures of me while I was photographing. And the pictures will come out in the Die Zeit magazine next coming week, I think. Anyhow, I said, whose film is this in this camera? He said, it's a Fuji film. I say, okay, why should we give money to Mr. Fuji? Why should we pay him for 3 or 4 pieces of film when I can do it with one exposure, which I've done all my life? Why should we waste your time and your expense that you pay me if you're doing an assignment? Life is so simple. Does that answer your question? In other words,
No.
Go ahead. Great. Now, what do you want to know?
I like the story, but it didn't answer my question. Because my question, can I?
Well, they laughed at my story.
Restate it was a
go
great
ahead.
story. But my question is especially about when you choose to use people. Yeah, when you have actually posed people in certain positions, in certain environments, and why you do that, or how these environments inspire you to pose people in a certain way.
Well, as you question,
as you did on,
All
for
right.
instance, the cover of this book.
Okay.
What is the story that's
I
in
got
your
you.
mind?
All right, now, when Pierre Luigi was talking about the building, describing the architecture and why we selected that photograph. But just before I actually set my camera, that was taken with my 35mm camera, but I also used my large camera for my professional picture. Before I actually did the photograph, I had the architect and the owner of the house stand up there in the window. And I told them a pair of binoculars looking out over the view. What does that pic? The 2 people are framed by that triangular element in the building construction. And without the people there, it was empty. Now, I put the 2 people there to give a feeling of occupancy, to have a feeling that somebody lives in the house. Then to add a little sex in the foreground, and also to block that dark shadow under the house, I put that handsome young lady with a dog. The dog was lucky because she was holding the guy pretty close to her little bosom. Well, anyhow, this is architectural photography, but it brings life to the photograph. Does that answer the question? Because in the same picture I took to show the people at the newspaper of the government president's residence office building, we walked away, and down the line I saw another composition which the architect and the photographer and the editor of the magazine were walking ahead of me. I said if I was going to photograph more pictures of this building, I would shoot this with those 3 people walking down there. Would have been a spontaneous exposure. So the people in my photographs are often natural people who just happen walking along a building. And if I had taken another picture, that would have been just as successful as the one with the reflection of the water, where I didn't use people, because for that purpose I didn't need them. Okay, any other questions?
What was Walter Gropius really thinking, saying that you captured the real spirit of Californian modernism in Kaufman picture?
Oh, no, that was the one, Paul Goldberger, who was the architectural editor of the New York Times.
Yeah, but you mentioned
The Pierre Koenig house.
No, the Pierre Koenig house. The Kaufman house by Neutra in Palm Springs.
Yes.
You talked to Walter Gropius, you said.
No, that was another subject.
Okay.
He was saying, well, I know what you mean, yes. He was referring to the fact that even that picture and also the picture of Pierre Koenig's case study house.
Right.
Both pictures were night photographs showing entirely different architecture and different locations.
Right.
But that's why, at that point, Gropius was saying, no matter what you're photographing, the architect and the photographer may plan this photograph, but what comes out you never know. Of course, you're at the mercy of the sky, the time of day, the exposure, but you hope that you got a good picture. I was lucky that God was with me, and he gave me whatever blessing on my shoulder to produce 2 famous photographs.
Right.
And it's not luck, it's just faith.
Who are the ladies in a Koenig?
The ladies were the girlfriends of the 2 architectural students who were students of Pierre Koenig when he was teaching at University of Southern California.
Right.
He told me this, he was going to have 2 students coming that night and that day to work with us during the day. And I said, Pierre, have the students bring their girlfriends and tell them to dress in summer. It was July and summertime. Dress in comfortable, nice dresses, and I'll use them as models. But I never dreamed that I would go outside during the time we're setting up some pictures inside the house to take a photograph from the outside. But I stepped outside, and as I walked down through the sliding door to see the view, I suddenly realized that the 2 girls were sitting inside just as they were in the picture, just talking to each other, talking about their boyfriends or something. So what happened was that I quickly ran in the house and told my assistant to bring the camera out, we're going to change the composition. That's how the picture began. Now, I didn't dream that this took a long time to photograph, because we took a time exposure with the lights off inside the house to get a view of the lights at night. It took a longer exposure. But as Joe Rosa said in my book, A Constructed View, about my biography, he said, which I never realized before, that actually when I take a photograph, I construct the view. And that answers the question of this young lady here about using people. Now, in that case, the girls were sitting there in the house because they're passing the time of day talking while my assistant and I were photographing other parts of the house. Then I saw the girl sitting there when I went outside, and I said, oh, that's going to be wonderful to show the house occupied by 2 attractive girls. And that same picture, by the way, later on was used by a fashion magazine, because they thought that girls were dressed nicely. But they were just ordinary common house dresses, just to wear in the summer evening in California.
Julius,
But
can I add just one thing? I was actually intrigued by the same questions about these people and the fact that these pictures were so luscious. And it's interesting to see where they were published at the very beginning. The first one, the Kaufman House, was published in 1949 on Life magazine. And the second one was in the Sunday supplement of the Los Angeles Examiner in the Pictorial Living section. That means that whenever these paintings were published for arts and architecture, the representation was much more cold and intellectual, much more abstract. Whereas Julius wanted to bring this desire for modern architecture because there was a major resistance on the behalf of clientele to acquire the vision of domesticity. And essentially, through his house, he's making a statement that you can live modernity, and it can be, he's probably one of the few people that's lived 50 years in Los Angeles in the same house, because there's a mobility built into the culture that shows that this architecture can be lived and you can build memories and stuff like that. And probably this also brought a new possibility of representation in the professional magazines, so that people can be accepted and stuff like that.
Is there another question?
Good. Now we go have supper. Thank you all really very much. Now you can all go out and design some good buildings, have a good life, don't smoke too many cigarettes.
Very, very much. Really. Thank you very much. Phenomenal.
Yes, and she remembered you taking the photograph. Because she's original, right?
Well, you should write an article.
Yeah.